episode of Black Girl Gone, I tell the story of Aesha Muhammad, a 23-year-old woman who went missing from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania in November 2000. At the time of her disappearance, Aesha was renting a room in West Philadelphia, but shortly after moving in, she began having issues with the owner of the house who also lived there. On November 30th, 2000, Aesha called her sister to pick her up after another argument, but her sister was not home. And when she called Aesha back, she didn't answer the phone. No one ever spoke to Aesha again. 3 days after she was last heard from, Aesha's 2-year-old son showed up alone at a church in East Orange, New Jersey. 24 years later, Aesha is still missing. What happened to her? And who is responsible for her disappearance? This is Aesha's story. The disappearance of Aesha Muhammad is a story that was requested to be re-uploaded. Originally, I first told this story back in 2021 when we first started Black Girl Gone. And since we continue to gain more listeners, I want to make sure that these stories are not forgotten. And so this week's episode is re-recorded so that those who haven't heard Aesha's story will. And so those that have, do not forget that 24 years later, she's still missing. And her family wants to know why. There isn't much information available about Aesha's life. We do know that she was born on October 11, 1977 in Chester, PA. Chester is a suburb of Philadelphia and an area much like the city itself, which has been plagued by violence over the years. Now, it's not clear, but it appears that Aesha had grown up in Chester, and by 1998, she had given birth to her only son. She was described by those who loved her as a friendly person who everyone liked. Aesha and her son's father were not together, but they were co-parenting their son and appeared to have a pretty good relationship. By all accounts, Aesha was a great mother who loved her son very much. At 23 years old, she had decided that she wanted to go to cosmetology school, and so she enrolled at the Venus Beauty Academy, located in Sharon Hill, Pennsylvania, another close suburb of Philadelphia. While attending school, Aesha also began working at a hair salon in Philadelphia. During this time, she and her son were living with her sister in Chester. However, the distance between Chester and her salon proved to be too long and exhausting for a daily commute, and so, realizing the need for a change, Aesha decided to move closer to both her school and her workplace to make her life more manageable. Anyone familiar with Philadelphia knows that the rent in the city can be very expensive. Well, rent is expensive everywhere at this point, but the suburbs, such as Sharon Hill, where Venus Academy is located, are often even more costly. And for a young mother juggling school and work, finding affordable housing was a challenge, I'm sure. Even in the year 2000, the search for a reasonably priced place to live was hard. Fortunately, Aesha knew someone who owned a large house in West Philadelphia, which was much closer to her job. This location would be ideal for her, reducing her commute and making her daily life easier. The house belonged to a man named Charles Dawkins, who, according to Aesha's profile on the Charlie Project, was said to be the half-brother of her father. However, the accuracy of this connection remains uncertain. Regardless, the house in West Philadelphia had a large enough room for Aesha and her son. Charles was in the process of renovating the property, but when Aesha expressed her need for a place to stay, she and Charles came to an agreement. She would pay him rent, and in return, she would have a room and a location that was much closer to work and school. The arrangement seemed perfect, providing her with a convenient and affordable place to live while she continued to work towards her goals. Now, as I mentioned earlier, Aesha and her son's father had a shared custody agreement, and according to reporting, the boy's father would take him during the week and Aesha would have him on the weekends. This arrangement made a single room plenty of space for her and her son, at least temporarily. Now, around late October or early November, Aesha moved into the West Philadelphia home where she began renting a room from Charles Dawkins. However, she had only been living there for a few weeks when tensions between her and Charles began to escalate. Now, the specific issues between them remain unclear, but according to Aisha's family, the situation was becoming increasingly more tense. She frequently expressed her frustrations with her living situation to her family and friends, indicating that the arrangement was not working out as she had hoped. Despite the initial promise of a convenient living arrangement, the growing issues with Charles added significant stress to her life, further complicating her efforts to balance work, school, and motherhood. Now, without any context regarding the nature of their relationship before Aisha moved in, it's hard to even speculate about why the two would be arguing. I mean, she was renting a room from him and hadn't even been there a month before the argument started. Aisha spent most of her time at school and work, and she had her son on the weekends. So, what was going on in that home that would cause them to be arguing after only a couple of weeks of living together? In November 2000, the week after Thanksgiving, Aisha called her son's father and asked if she could have more time with their son. And so he and Aisha agreed that she would keep the 2-year-old with her from November 27th to December 8th. But things between Charles was getting worse, and by November 29th, Aisha was becoming more and more frustrated with him and his alleged behavior. According to her sister, Aisha called her and told her that Charles was quote unquote acting crazy. And so Aisha's sister told her that she could move in with her. On November 30th, according to reporting, Aisha called her brother Solomon, and she told Solomon that she needed her sister Wakita to come and pick her up because she had been arguing with Charles and she just couldn't take it anymore. She told her brother that Charles was still acting crazy and that he had thrown her dinner in the trash. Wakita, however, was not home, and so Solomon didn't have a car, but he told Aisha that he would tell their sister to call her as soon as she came home. And her sister wasn't the only person that she called that day. Aisha also called her son's father, and according to him, although they had agreed that Aisha would keep their son until December 8th, she said that she needed to bring him back because she had plans for the weekend. Now, the way this is reported in a few places, it makes this part of the story seem like it's disconnected from what is happening at the house that Aisha lived in with Charles. But what it looks like to me is that whatever was happening in that home had reached a breaking point and Aisha needed to move out ASAP, which would have been harder for her to do with a 2-year-old. But regardless, Aisha made arrangements to drop their son off back to his father's house in Chester. And when Wakita returned home, Solomon told her about speaking to Aisha and what she had said about Charles and needing her to come pick her up. And so Wakita called Aisha, but she did not answer the phone. After being unable to reach her sister, her family started calling Charles to ask him if he knew where she was, but Charles wasn't answering the phone either. And so they began leaving him multiple messages demanding that he call them back. Finally, after numerous calls and messages, Charles speaks to Aisha's family, and he told them something that was very hard for them to believe. He said that Aisha packed her things and moved out with her son. But her family immediately knew that something was wrong. How could she have gotten all of her things out of the house? She did not have a car, and so how would she have just left? It's the year 2000, so there's no Uber or Lyft. And, I mean, she could have taken a cab, but a cab to where? The only logical place she would have gone would have been her sister's house, but she, of course, was not there. And no one had spoken to Aisha. From the beginning, Aisha's family was immediately suspicious of Charles. They knew about the fact that the two had been fighting, and now Aisha and her son were gone. After speaking to Charles and hearing that Aisha had allegedly moved out of the house that she was staying in, her siblings were beginning to panic. It had now been a couple of days since anyone had seen or spoken to Aisha and her son. And so her siblings decided that they needed to call their father, who was living in Atlanta at the time, to let him know that Aisha was missing and what Charles had told them. As soon as Aisha's father found out that his daughter was missing, he got on a plane and flew to Philadelphia to look for his daughter. When Aisha's father arrived in Philadelphia, he gathered with the rest of the family and they decided to go over to the home where Aisha was living as a group. But when they arrived, what they found would immediately deepen their suspicion that something bad might have happened to Aisha, and possibly her son too. When her family arrives at the home in West Philadelphia, where she had only been living for a few weeks, they are disturbed, not by what they find, but what they don't find. Charles let Aisha's family into the home, and when they go to the room where she was staying, they find absolutely nothing belonging to her. The room had been completely cleaned out. All that was in the room was a single dresser and a bed with a fitted sheet on the mattress. Charles, once again, told Aisha's family that she had packed up her things and left. Now, it's not clear from the reporting if Aisha's family had gone to police at this point or not, but they were extremely worried about Aisha. Before she disappeared, there was nothing in her life that was causing her trouble besides her living arrangements with Charles. Aisha was in school, and she was working, and more than that, she was raising her son, and had a pretty good relationship with his father, so it was very unlikely that Aisha had just gone by choice. 3 days after Aisha was last seen, as her family in Philadelphia was becoming more and more concerned about her and her son, another mystery was unfolding miles away in the city of East Orange, New Jersey, and it would take police days before they would connect it to what happened to Aisha.
Good morning, Gray. Check out my drop top. Get your swagger back at...
On November 30th, 2000, 23-year-old Aisha Muhammad called her sister to pick her up after her living situation had become unbearable. But when her sister calls her back, she gets no answer, and no one ever speaks to Aisha again. 3 days after she was last seen, this mystery would deepen. In early December 2000, 3 days after Aisha had last spoken to her family, a church called Liberty Temple was hosting their usual late morning Sunday service when they heard a knock at the door. Now, I said knock, but it was actually described more like a banging at the door. One of the deacons from the church got up and went to see who and why someone was banging on the door during their service. And when the deacon opened the door, standing there crying was Aisha's 2-year-old son, alone. Whoever had been banging on the door had just left the child at the front door and fled. The knocks were too loud to have been done by the child. And so the deacon brought him inside and told the pastor about the little boy. And at first, the pastor assumed that he had to be a child of someone in the congregation who had just lost track of him during service. But when the end of service came, he asked the congregation whose child he was, and no one claimed to be with the child. Aisha's son was understandably upset. He was just 2.5, and he had been left at a strange place alone. But the staff at the church had no idea who the child was. They also had no idea that 82 miles away in Philadelphia, that his mother's family was looking for him and his mom. Aisha's son was eventually able to tell the church staff his name, but he couldn't tell them how he had gotten to the church or who had dropped him off. The staff tried to locate the child's family, but no one knew who he was. Eventually, after attempts to locate the child's family, the church staff was left with no other choice but to call the police. The fact that Aisha's son had ended up at the front door of this church is really one of the strangest parts of this case. Now, when I'm doing research, I always like to Google map certain locations so I can get a complete visual of it. And when I looked up the information about this church where Aisha's son was dropped off, I read that they had been in several different locations since the church first began. And in the year 2000, Liberty Temple was hosting service on the second floor of an auto body shop after the city had kicked them out of the previous location due to eminent domain. And so, we aren't talking about a traditional looking church. It probably had a sign in the window, but nothing about this place says that there's a church upstairs. And so, it's very strange that of all the churches in East Orange, the person who dropped off Aisha's son chose that church. Now, back in Philadelphia, Aisha's family had no idea that their nephew and grandson had been found safe in New Jersey. On December 9th, 2000, 10 days after Aisha was last seen or heard from, one of her sisters went to visit her boyfriend, who was in jail at the time in New Jersey. And during their visit, though, he tells her something that she was not expecting to hear from him on her visit. He tells her that he was watching TV and that he could have sworn he saw her nephew, Aisha's son, on the news. Recalling the story to the Philadelphia Daily News, Aisha's sister said that when he told her that, she became hysterical because at that time, Aisha and her son had been missing for almost 2 weeks. In East Orange, Aisha's son's photo had been plastered all over the news and local papers, but that news had not made it all the way to Philadelphia. So it was really fate that Aisha's sister's boyfriend saw the news that day. Once Aisha's family found out the information about her son being found, they contacted the East Orange Police Department so that they could go and get him. Within a week of Aisha's son showing up at the Liberty Church, he was reunited with her family, miraculously physically unharmed. But with him back in their custody, dread about where Aisha was and what happened to her was even bigger than it was before. Aisha was a great mom, and so they knew that she just didn't leave her son at some church in New Jersey. And so at that point, they were 100% sure that something bad had happened to her. And once they started to ask her son questions, what they believed would be confirmed. Now, once Aisha's son was back with her family, the 2-year-old began to talk to them about the last time he saw his mommy, and what he said was beyond disturbing. When Aisha's siblings asked their nephew what happened to his mom, her son told them that his mommy was dead. Shocking words coming out of any child's mouth, but especially a 2-year-old. But Aisha's son was clearly a very smart 2-year-old, and so when he began talking about what happened to his mom, they believed him. He also told them that there was a fight and that a man had punched his mommy in the face and she was bleeding. He said that, quote, "I was fighting him and mommy was fighting with him." Now, here's what's interesting. Aisha's son identified who he said killed his mommy by name, but I don't believe that that person's name was ever publicly released. But by this time, police were now investigating Aisha's disappearance, and they spoke to her son, who told them the same story that he had told his family. Police also spoke to several other people, including Charles Dawkins, Aisha's landlord. And when they spoke to Charles, they were fully aware of the issues that existed between him and Aisha prior to her going missing. But when police spoke to Charles, much like her family, they didn't believe what he was telling them. And he confirmed he was lying by changing his story about where Aisha was in the 2 interviews that police had with him. After changing his story, police asked Charles to take a lie detector test, which was scheduled for January 2001. While police were interviewing possible witnesses, they were also searching the area for any signs of Aisha, but they were coming up with nothing. Now, it's not clear from reporting where police searched for Aisha. I mean, seeing that her son had turned up 82 miles away in New Jersey could have meant that she was there or that her body had been dumped there. But either way, Aisha had disappeared, and her family and police were becoming more and more concerned that she had met with foul play. I'm sure police were hoping that the results of Charles' lie detector test would help give them some answers, but Charles did not take that lie detector test as scheduled in January 2001. Instead, he fled. Now, here's one of the more frustrating things about this case. With everything police seem to have had on Charles, it's not really clear whether or not he was ever formally a suspect. But if he wasn't a suspect, then he was free to leave. Except he wasn't really free to leave because Charles was on parole after being released from prison. Apparently, he had served time for aggravated robbery and burglary, and in 1989 became a fugitive after failing to return from a furlough from prison. Charles remained a fugitive until 1993 when he was arrested again and resentenced for his escape. He wasn't released from prison until April 2000, a few months before Aesha moved into his home and went missing. When he fled the state, he also stopped checking in for parole, and so a warrant was issued for his arrest. Months went by, and police continued to look for Aesha, but they were unable to locate any evidence or information about what had happened to her. After nearly 6 months on the run, Charles Dawkins was finally caught after being pulled over in Camden, New Jersey. And after police ran his information and discovered the warrant for his arrest, he was arrested, and he was sent back to state prison for multiple parole violations. But he was never charged in connection to Aesha's disappearance. With no witnesses, and no evidence, and no information, Aesha's case went completely cold. Aesha's family kept looking for her, but as time went on, hope was fading. 2 years after she went missing, the Philadelphia Cold Case Unit started to look into her case, and a $1,000 reward was offered for any information in her disappearance, but unfortunately, it did not lead to any new information. Aesha's son went on to live with his father, who raised him, but life never really moved on for her family. As of the re-recording of this episode, there's been no updated information about Aesha's disappearance, or any new information about the investigation. It's now been 24 years since Aesha vanished. Her son had to grow up without his mother, and her family has been left with the unknown, unable to get closure. After 24 years, cases like this need people to speak up. The chances of evidence coming up are slim, although not impossible. And like all missing person cases, we can't stop caring until we bring home the missing and bring closure to their families. Aesha's family believes that she is no longer alive, but they want to bring her home so that they can lay her to rest. Her case is cold, and since there hasn't been any recently updated information, this is where we leave her story, incomplete. Because after 2002, we have no clue what, if anything, happened. But we do know that Aesha deserves to be found. Her case deserves to be solved, and her family deserves to know what happened to her, especially her son. If you have any information about Aesha Muhammad's whereabouts or the circumstances of her disappearance, please contact the Philadelphia Police Department.